Hello and welcome to more history stuff. As you can see, I've changed the format on here a little bit. Instead of just staring at me with a blank wall behind me, you've now got a striking image to look at while I'm tucked away in the corner. It's just part of an attempt to try and make these videos a bit more visually appealing, and they might get a bit more sophisticated as I get more to grips with the technology. But today I wanted to talk about round table tournaments, which were an interesting medieval custom. As the name suggests, they were based on the round table of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of and needs little explanation. Now, the story of King Arthur was extremely popular in the medieval era, and many kings, real life kings, were in the habit of staging round table pageants or ceremonies where they and their knights would dress up as the characters from the Arthurian legend and hold jousts and tourneys for a day. And they would actually pretend to be, for the duration of the pageant, they would pretend to be the characters from the legend. And one of these round table tournaments was held in Scotland in January 1302 by Edward I, Edward I of England, Longshanks, on the site of the Battle of Falkirk, where he had defeated William Wallace 4 years earlier in 1298. Now, the Battle of Falkirk was fought on the 22nd of July 1298. And Edward staged this round table tournament in January 4 years later. So he wasn't celebrating the anniversary of the battle as such, even though it was on the site of it. One theory which seems most likely is that he held the tournament to both celebrate the anniversary of his victory, but also to celebrate the defection of Robert the Bruce, the future King Robert I, victor of Bannockburn. Who at this stage had decided to abandon the Scots and join Edward, to join the English and help him fight the Scots, and he would remain in Edward's service for the next 4 years. I'll go into what that was all about in another video perhaps, but for the purposes of this video, I want to talk about this tournament or pageant that Edward held, probably in honour of Bruce's decision to join the king, to join the English side. So these were very elaborate ceremonies. They were quite popular in England. Some of Edward's predecessors had liked to stage round table tournaments, but Edward was particularly keen on the Arthurian legend. He was a bit of a King Arthur nut. And he used Arthurian imagery quite a lot in Wales and Scotland as a form of propaganda, and also because he was personally very, very fond of the legend. And we happen to have a description by a Flemish writer called Lodewijk van Velthelm, who gave a detailed description of what these round table tournaments that Edward I liked to stage, what they actually looked like. And I'm reading off my notes here, which is why I keep glancing over here. So this, according to Lodewijk's account, is how they worked. The king, Edward I, would announce that a play or spell of King Arthur was to be enacted. He and his best knights would then choose which characters from the Arthurian legend they would play for the day. Now, obviously, Edward would be Arthur himself, because he was the king, King Arthur. But his knights would usually choose Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Percival, Sir Agravain, Bors, Gareth, Lionel, Mordred and Kay. And anyone who knows anything about the Arthurian legend will find that quite an unsurprising list. Particularly Lancelot and Gawain, because they are two of the most prominent knights, two of the most prominent characters of the Arthurian legend. The tournament, in which the knights would divide into two companies and then charge each other and fight in this sort of mock battle in the lists, would start at sunrise. And then there was this quite unusual ceremony where the knight who was playing Sir Kay, who is the buffoon of the legend, he's this sort of cowardly scoundrel who everybody mocks, He was played by some unfortunate knight who would be attacked at one point by 20 young men. This is all part of the play act. They would cut his saddle and throw him to the ground while the audience laughed and cheered. This is all in fun though, apparently, and the knight playing Kay was not, in theory, badly hurt. And after the tourney was over, after the fighting was over, and everyone had beaten each other to a pulp and presumably had a jolly old time, the king turned from the field to the banquet hall, where he and his knights, presumably nursing their bruises, would sit at the table round and have a feast. And then something else very unusual would happen. After each course of the meal, a squire would enter the hall and abuse the assembled knights as cowards. He would say, "You're all cowards." A challenge would then be issued to each knight who was duty bound to accept. He'd be challenged to go on some quest or other, to go riding off into the forest and win some trophy or fight some famous champion. Just as in Arthurian legend, because that's what King Arthur's knights were always doing. They were always riding out on quests for the Holy Grail or some other glorious objective. And then at the end of the third course of the meal, things got seriously odd. The squire who entered after the third course would then be, he would enter in this very elaborate costume. He would be mounted on a thin, limping horse, and he would be dressed as the Loathly Damsel, the ugly damsel, this very ugly woman. And the Flemish writer gives a very vivid description of what this costume looked like. Her nose a foot long and a palm in width, her ears like those of an ass, coarse braids hanging down to her girdle, a goiter on her long red neck, 2 teeth projecting a finger's length from her wry mouth. So you can imagine this bizarre scene. You've got King Edward and his knights feasting inside this big pavilion, this big tent, all pretending to be King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. They're all play acting. And then this boy comes in dressed up in this extraordinary costume on this sickly horse. And he abuses them as well and tells them they're cowards and challenges one of them to go on some quest to prove himself. And now all of this may sound very elaborate and a bit weird and possibly a bit childish, but similar accounts of these round table pageants or masquerades are given by other chroniclers. William of Rishinger, an English chronicler of St Albans, he gives very similar accounts. They were also very popular in France. A French romance called La Romane de Hem describes a very similar round table pageant being held in northern France. These things were quite common. They were popular all throughout the medieval period. These medieval kings and their knights, they very much liked to dress up as Arthur and Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Percival, Mordred, all the rest of them, and to basically replay their sort of romantic fantasies, their childhood fantasies of being King Arthur and being Lancelot and Gawain and riding out on these extraordinary quests to win honour and fame and renown. Which is very interesting, really, when you consider where the King Arthur story came from. I mean, it's almost certainly British or Welsh, Brythonic in origin. And the early tales, in the early sort of Welsh chronicles and poetry, the bits and pieces that survive, they really bear no resemblance to the Norman French romances that take over from the early medieval period onwards. And if Arthur ever was a historical figure, which is a big if, of course, we don't know if he was a real person, he would have probably been a 5th or 6th century warlord, a Romano-British warlord fighting probably the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic invaders, after the Roman legions left in the 5th or 6th century AD. Or at least that's the most popular theory, we don't really know. And a person like that would not have resembled this chivalrous king sitting in this sort of mythical Camelot surrounded by knights in armour. That's very much the medieval tradition. But this is what the historical kings of the medieval era believed in and what they thought was true. And this was the kind of pageant that Edward I staged in January on the site of the Battle of Falkirk in 1302, with Robert the Bruce, the famous Scottish hero, sitting by his side. We don't know if Bruce took part, but if he did, it would be interesting to know which Arthurian character he played. Hopefully not Sir Mordred. And if anybody knows a bit about Arthurian legend, you might know what I mean by that. But anyway, there we go. Just a short, a medieval curiosity, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed the striking new visuals. I'll see you next time.